Good evening, everyone. It's great to see you all here in Lower Manhattan. I'm Jaclyn Slimm from the Alliance for Downtown New York, and we are the Business Improvement District for Lower Manhattan, south of Chambers Street. Our mission is to provide service advocacy, research, and information to advance Lower Manhattan as a global model of a 21st century central business district for businesses, residents, and visitors. The Downtown Alliance has long been committed to advancing Lower Manhattan's spirit of innovation. Through our initiative, LaunchLM, we are working to unite current and future creative and technology companies to collaborate, share ideas, and forge new possibilities. Today, Lower Manhattan is home to more than 800 technology, advertising, media, and information companies who recognize that this is a great place to do business and grow. The center of gravity for creative industries is moving downtown, and we're embarking on a new initiative to build a digital roadmap for Lower Manhattan to ensure the district remains a forward-looking, technology-oriented, and digitally immersed community into the future. Each week, we've had a different Lower Manhattan firm curate a group of thought leaders to speak to a different topic. I'm excited to introduce tonight's event, the fourth in a series of 6 around the theme of communication, and it's been curated by Annalect and Packet. We want your ideas too, so at the end of this, you'll find a videographer at the back of the crowd, and we invite you to share any idea you might have about how we can craft Lower Manhattan's digital future. I'd also like to thank Howard Hughes for hosting the series here at the South Street Seaport and including us in the Summer Sea Change program. I hope you'll join us at our upcoming events, which includes a discussion next week around the theme of arts and culture. It's also going to be totally cool. Definitely come, same time, same place. And with that, here's Scott Anderson from Control Group.
Hey there, everyone. Scott Anderson, Control Group. Nice to see you. Nice night. Thanks for joining us. This is part of a great effort between Control Group, LaunchLM, and a group of companies down here to help reimagine Lower Manhattan's digital future. And to that end, if you would like to get involved, please come see us afterwards. I'd like to introduce a close friend of Control Group and of LaunchLM, the CEO of annalect, Scott Hagedorn. He is the architect behind a massive effort to reinvent the fundamentals of data-driven marketing. Wow. And he's head of a global company with about 500 employees. It's an omnicom company. He's also one of the smartest people I know and was the first person that I thought of to talk about this subject, which is really close and important to our vision of responsive cities, of building in this data-driven intelligence to not only get better insights about our neighborhood, about our city, about ourselves, but also Scott is one of the ones figuring out how we derive those insights and how we can pay for some of these advancements through marketing and advertising. Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Hagedorn.
Hello, Lower Manhattan and people drinking beer, wondering what's going on right now. One of the reasons I got involved with what's going on in Lower Manhattan was my interest sort of in how we can connect technology and history, and how communications and technology have almost always played a role down here. The building where my office is in is the original AT&T building. Across the street from it on Day Street, which is straight down Fulton, Alexander Graham Bell made the first long distance call to Watson in San Francisco. 2 years later from that, he, from the top floor of our building where he used to live, made the first international long distance phone call. So the history down here is steeped in technology, communications, and creativity. So it's a great place to have this debate and think about this forum. And so I'm going to briefly, one by one, introduce our panelists today. Each one's going to talk a little bit about what they think is cool. I'm going to ask a couple questions. We welcome you guys also to ask a couple questions from the audience, and we'll just see how it goes, and keep drinking beer and whatnot. So Greta sitting next to me. Greta is an urban planner and a senior field analyst at New America Foundation's Open Technology Institute. Her work is focusing right now on digital access, disaster response, and new ways to use technology, like low power FM and other things. So Greta's going to talk a little bit about herself and also a bit about mesh networking, right?
Yes, that's right. Thanks.
I have a really weird like mic height thing right now that I'm going to solve for, but.
Thanks. Great to be here. Hope you're enjoying your beer. So I'm here from Washington, D.C., and I work at a think tank. So that's a pretty unusual place to be actually doing technology projects. But that is what we do. We have been working for about 5 years in underserved communities, particularly in Detroit and in Brooklyn, to build mesh networks with the residents in those places. We've also worked in India and in Tunisia, but primarily our operations have been in the US. In Brooklyn, we worked with the community there to build a mesh network, which if you don't know what a mesh network is, it's a wireless network that is not centralized. So that means that the traffic, the internet traffic, is routed among all the routers, and it doesn't pass through any central point that decides where the traffic is going to go. What we realized in working with communities to sort of do these DIY networks was that you couldn't kind of drop in there with some technology and give it to people and expect them to even want to engage with it. So we saw all these potential benefits for mesh networks, aside from access, which if you don't know, about a third of Americans do not have internet access at home. I know a lot of people are really surprised by that number. And a lot of those people in Red Hook live in the public housing there. But aside from access, other things you can do with mesh networks is you can do local data collection. So people can, for instance, gather their own air quality data, and then they can go to their city government and say, look, this is really a problem where we live, and they have evidence that they can use. But in Red Hook, we started building this network, and the local residents had decided that they wanted to use it, for example, to keep their own statistics on stop and frisk. So they wanted to keep their own records of how many times residents were being stopped on the street by the police. So we were doing stuff like that with the network, and then Sandy hit. And another thing to know about mesh networks is that they can route around points of failure. So because they don't have a centralized hub that tells the traffic where to go, the mesh networks can say, like, okay, that router went down. The network is going to figure out another way to send the data. So they're amazingly resilient. So after Sandy hit, all the major cell networks went down in Red Hook and elsewhere, like Lower Manhattan. So large networks are subject to these kinds of cascading failures, but these scrappy little DIY mesh network in Red Hook kept running. And that meant that the local residents there could organize volunteers. They could figure out who needed help, where they were. They were getting pizza orders from the Midwest, and they were able to figure out where in Red Hook to send the pizza. When FEMA showed up, FEMA said, okay, everything else has failed. Can we actually build our first response upon your mesh network, your scrappy little neighborhood mesh network? And of course we said, and Red Hook Initiative, our partner in Red Hook, said, of course you can. And so the little scrappy DIY network became the basis of operations for FEMA in their Red Hook recovery effort. So we found that mesh networks, they're really effective in this kind of scenario. This was a little bit of a surprise for us, even though we knew that a mesh network would have this kind of potential. But what's really magical about them is that you have this resilience capacity combined with this really community-driven capacity. So not only do you have this resilience capacity, but also you have that capacity to do things like, for people to keep their own records of stop and frisk. So you put those things together, and it's a really amazingly transformative tool of change in areas that have been traditionally underserved. So we have just put in a proposal with the New York City Department of Economic Development Corporation, the EDC, for the RISE NYC competition, and we want to build 6 more of these networks, just like the Red Hook Initiative network. We want to work with communities in various areas that are low-lying in the flood zones of New York City. Work with community organizations in these areas to really do like a bottom-up grassroots effort. And we're hoping to get started in the fall. And that's it. We got somebody's beeping it. It is my timer. Thank you.
That's precision. Yeah. So Jonathan, to Greta's left, is the head of data science for a company that is near and dear to our heart called PlaceIQ. PlaceIQ is a company that's trying to figure out how to make sense of the deluge of the amount of geospatial data that's available. And clearly, if you're messing with geospatial data, you have to have a PhD in physics from Yale. So Jonathan has that. So Jonathan, why don't you tell us about yourself and what's going on with PlaceIQ?
Absolutely. Hi, everybody. My name is Jonathan Lenaghan. I run the data science group at PlaceIQ. The public face of our company is, like Scott, we are a digital marketing. We're a digital marketing company. But I think at our heart, what we really are trying to accomplish is we're building an at-scale geo-analytics platform. And in order to do this, we are dividing, at first, the United States into 100 meter by 100 meter tiles, and we ingest all kinds of data. It can be the building footprints, it can be polygons that represent the building footprints. It can be point data, demographic data. We ingest all of this data. We attribute this data to tiles, and this is how we build our base map. After this, we ingest what we call movement data. And this movement data, in the context of mobile advertising, are ad request logs. And we ingest, about 120 billion ad requests each month, most of which are attributed with some sort of location data. At its heart, though, the platform can intake any sort of movement data, anything that has a unique identifier, a location, as well as a timestamp. So it can be a Foursquare check-in, it can be a geocoded tweet, it can be a GPS device which is attached to a fleet vehicle. And our platform, just being composed of tiles and time periods and a proprietary taxonomy, we're able to do very large geospatial computations at scale. And so even though the business we're in now is the geo-targeting of mobile ads, we're extremely interested in moving into the public sector, working with NGOs to use our system to help people better understand the flow of people through neighborhoods, to better understand retail site selection, residential site selection, to help with city planning problems as well.
Great. So to Jonathan's left is Nick O'Brien. Nick is the acting director for the Mayor's Office on Data Analytics. He's responsible and manages the office for all the data acquisition, compliance, how it flows into the system. And he's actually responsible for liberating the liberation of data, of New York City data, to be used for cool stuff like creating new applications and thinking about new ways to help improve the life of the people that live down here and work down here. So Nick, maybe we can get a little bit about what's going on with the city from you.
Great, thanks, Scott. So I think actually Jonathan gives me a good jumping off point, because we do what they do on a much more rudimentary basis. We serve as a cross-agency data analytics shop. We've tried to bring together a whole bunch of different data sets all around the city. All of them have different ways that they're set up for different purposes. Department of Buildings has a ID tag for each of the buildings around here and throughout the entire city. Department of Finance tries to collects what they know about a ownership parcel so they can tax it. And there's a huge variation between those two just very basic ways of understanding the city. For example, you go out to Breezy Point, it's cooperatively owned, you have 1,800 buildings on a single lot. You have a lot of schools that span multiple tax lots. So we don't necessarily have a unified platform, but what we've tried to do is bring it all together and create that taxonomy. And it's similar to what PlaceIQ does, but on sort of more known, bigger data sets. To try and drive, at least what we've started with is enforcement and targeting around the city, which I think is also not so different of targeted marketing. So we've done stuff around fire risk and illegal conversions, trying to figure out which 311 calls are more likely to be dangerous, so that's a targeting exercise there. We've done it around figuring out which grease traps around the city are most likely to get clogged and cause floods. That's a targeting exercise. And then in the new administration, the universal pre-K is one of the major initiatives, and we've worked on targeting 4-year-olds so we can get them into the schools. It's not an enforcement thing, but it is a similar sort of targeting exercise, and bringing the city's data together in one place so we can effectively look at them is what we're trying to do. The next step, now that we've built this architecture and brought a lot of the city's data together, we like to think we brought all of it together, but we keep finding new stuff, is we've started to push it out to the public so that people can build apps on top of it, they can generate insights. And I think the next thing that I'm interested really in working on is figuring out how the city can pick up those insights, because the early applications built on top of open data really have been public-facing, helping the public understand what we have, how they can make sense of it. And I really want to move into a space where the city can consume that insight, make decisions, drive operations, not only based on analysis we're doing internally, but also things that smart people, when given access to the data, can also turn up. And I think, admittedly, that's lacking right now because operational processes are difficult to move. Changing the city is a lot like turning an aircraft carrier, and we need to be a little more like a speedboat on some of these issues.
Yep, killer. So, and this is a nice transition from the NYC Ask a Local to thinking about Ask a Global on a global basis. Anthony got out of school as a philosophy major, so he made the sane jump into the tech industry, then went and traveled the world, and I think was inspired by his travels and how local it can feel, but oftentimes how communications and language sometimes can be the Tower of Babel that move people apart. So Anthony's company Findyr, which he is the CEO and founder of, sorry, I got those two flipped, helps you connect through technology to ask a local a question about what's going on with the city, and he's about to launch his global platform.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. And thank you for inviting me to the panel. At Findyr, we're kind of tackling the same general data question, which is that data is important for decision making, but what do you do in situations where there's not a lot of data available? Data poor areas, and as kind of Scott alluded to, a lot of my background was spent in places like Africa where cities really don't have a lot of data, and we see similar things I think in America as well, say in urban inner city areas where there's just not a lot of data available. And so at Findyr we kind of started to tackle that question. We took advantage of two trends. One was the proliferation of smartphones, and there's 1.5 billion smartphones in the world right now, and that's growing at 50% a year. So it's really not like it used to be. Even people in Central Africa, for example, have access to a smartphone where you can get one for $40 right now. And then the other trend we took advantage of was what you might call kind of the Uberification of economics, where it's becoming more possible to do on-demand work, and you can use marketplaces to take advantage of people's local knowledge or local information or local products, and then supply them in sort of a dispersed, decentralized manner. And so what we did is developed a platform that allows you to ask questions or ask for information to be collected by people in our community, or you can answer those questions or collect that information. So for example, we can kind of sit here in New York and ask someone right now in Uganda to perform a survey of 18 to 34-year-olds who have an interest in data and ask them certain questions, and vice versa. Someone in Uganda could ask a question here, and actually I think we all have kind of similar interest in geospatial representation of data, and we do the same thing and use geospatial as a way of targeting in the data collection, and then also structuring and presenting the data. So what's happened is, it's been really interesting, is that we've kind of empowered people locally all over the world. We're in 100 countries right now, and, to take advantage of a resource that they have that they don't think that they have, which is local knowledge, local expertise, local access to information. And it's something that's they might even not even realize is valuable, but it actually is. For example, consumer products companies might want to know and survey people's perceptions of their products at a local level, and that could be very, very difficult to do using traditional services-based survey methodology. Whereas we can kind of tap into those very local people and go inside a souk in the Middle East or a marketplace in the middle of Africa, and kind of use local people and empower them to kind of do these surveys themselves. And then we can obtain that data, and it becomes very valuable in kind of global economic sense. And what's even more interesting is that the information is very inexpensive to obtain, because we're kind of cutting out all of the middlemen in between asking and answering questions and collecting data. And that kind of changes the way that you use data, and it allows you to be much more experimental with data and try out different things and not have to kind of spend 3 months structuring your survey like I did, when I did my PhD fieldwork. You can kind of just ask a few questions and kind of hone in on what you want to do, and then you can perform your survey. And then because it is inexpensive, and because we can tap in to such large labor pools of people who can obtain this data, you can actually obtain very large amounts of data. So for example, in a township in South Africa recently, we had a group of about 24 people spread out around the township. And mind you, this is an area that a person like me would, it would probably be pretty dangerous to go to. You really have to be a kind of local to even sort of enter these areas. And so there's very, very little data available. What we're able to do is send people out, a couple dozen people using the app, and then survey local businesses. And these are businesses that really have no exposure but beyond a kind of 2 or 3 block area. We're able to obtain that data, geotag it, get time date stamps, do surveys of people in the stores about perceptions of products, take photos, take videos, and things like that, and produce data products, and do so. This was a project for a nonprofit in a way that even nonprofits are able to afford. And so it's really kind of opened up the kind of data origination market, I think, to a lot of small businesses, to nonprofits, even to individuals, in a way that hasn't yet really been available. And kind of where I'd like to leave off is that I think what happens when you're able to kind of communicate and obtain data and share data and information so easily between cities is that you can kind of connect cities and information and compare them in ways that haven't yet really been available. So for example, there's obviously a huge amount of data available about New York City, and it's something that maybe a mayor of Kampala, Uganda would be very interesting to compare to, but he doesn't necessarily have that type of data. And so by being able to kind of access it using apps like Findyr, he's able to get that and then use that for comparison's sake and kind of develop the city and develop, what we would call here kind of smart city approaches. So thank you.
Thanks. So we've heard a little bit about how we use technology and data to create, to connect, to mine, to improve the experience. Let's talk a little bit now about how we use data to tell stories. So our final panelist is Sarah Williams. She's currently the Assistant Professor of Urban Planning and the Director of the Civic Data Design Lab at MIT. She uses various techniques to mine and tell stories out of the data and get to the data points that matter specifically about some of her insights and pieces. As I was reading your bio, I was super fascinated to think and understand that your work in visualization and bringing insights to life actually is being shown at the Guggenheim and the MoMA, and it's really impactful and empowering. When I was going on and doing the research, I was really struck by how strongly the stories came out and how telegraphically they were there. So I'd love to hear kind of your take on storytelling and what you're working on and where it's going.
Great, thanks so much. I think I might just hold this. Might be easier than leaning in. So I think I've been asked to join this incredible group because we're all working with data, and I work with data and information to tell stories, as Scott said. And I just thought I'd ask everybody in the audience, how many people work with data? Oh, good. Half of you. How many people have used a data visualization as evidence for an argument? Almost everybody. That's really exciting. So that's exactly the kind of things that I want to do with data and that my lab tries to do. Right now, I'm working on a project with the New York City public schools where we're trying to teach data literacy, and we're trying to teach youth how to read data visualizations ethically and responsibly, but also bring in qualitative information to these stories. So in that particular project, we're looking at how much money is spent buying lottery tickets and how much money is won. And the students learn the odds are always against them. And then they go out into their neighborhoods and they ask bodega store owners and players what they think about these odds that they can see through the data. And this is data that we actually got from the New York State through doing a FOIA request. So open access to information was available. And really bringing together kind of qualitative and quantitative stories as a way to teach data literacy. Our lab is also working on a project in Kenya, and we just finished that. And actually that was a project where we wanted to collect data about the informal bus system in Kenya. And the informal bus system is the main public transport, and there was no data or information about that system. So we actually used cell phones to collect that data, translated it into a standardized format, and hopefully you'll be seeing it on Google Maps, but apps have been built off of it, routing apps for cell phones, but also we created a visualization that anybody can use to navigate the bus system in Nairobi. Actually, we've got the newspapers to actually put the paper map in as inserts so it's kind of very low tech and high tech at the same time. So one of the things I'm doing right now, and one of the things I wanted to kind of just leave off with, and I hopefully it can spark a conversation, is I'm working on a book that's called Data for a Public Good, or the title might change. I love your feedback and critique, but really what I'm talking about is that with all the hype of big data doesn't do anything. It's actually how we transform it and operationalize it that makes it powerful. And so visualizing data is really important in that story of transforming big data into something, but also creating new data collection strategies, opening data up and having people build on top of it is really an important component to making big data powerful. Also, kind of the idea of bringing qualitative and quantitative data together. I think one of the things that we forget in this era of big data is that it can't solely tell us a story. We need to hear it from the voice of the public and from the people. And so creating ways to bring quantitative analysis with kind of narratives of people on the ground is really essential in this era of big data. And then finally, I really think to make data impactful, we have to build teams to work with it. And what I mean by that is if we think we're going to address a particular policy issue, we need to build a team of a policy analyst that kind of really has thought about that issue critically, a geospatial analyst like myself or others here at the table, and also a graphics artist, graphics designers, and people who really can help us bite off that story and make it editable for everybody, and to be able to kind of simply communicate our ideas. And so with that, I kind of want to open up the conversation, I thought, or Scott's I have some questions for us, but I really think transforming and building teams to work with data is kind of an important component in the next era of big data analysis.
And definitely figuring out ways to smash together data sets that don't typically talk to each other, and make sure that it's got some stability. I'll start with, since we're on that subject, I'll start with PlaceIQ. How do you guys bring together multiple data sets? And then if you were going to paint a picture of Lower Manhattan in this area, what story would it tell?
Okay, it's a good question. So I think in terms of smashing together the different data sets, this is something that PlaceIQ, the platform that we're building, is sort of ideally suited to do. So I think anybody who's worked with geospatial data, it comes in all forms with all kinds of attribution. There are some standards, but it's still a pretty gnarly problem trying to join various sets of data that are attributed with both the location as well as any sort of demographics or counts, for example. And what we do at PlaceIQ is we immediately normalize all sets of all data that comes in into either 100-meter tiles or 10 by 10 meter tiles. We apply it to a taxonomy, and we attribute any timestamps to a taxonomy of time periods as well. And because we immediately normalize everything that comes in into tiles, time periods, and taxonomy, it becomes very simple to join any sort of disparate data set that you have. And so even though I say we're building a geospatial analytics platform, we're really abstracting away the geospatialness of the data. So at the end, once you get the results, you can translate them back into geospatial constructs. But what we're hoping to do is empower people who are not geospatial experts or experts in geospatial analysis to be able to run analyses at scale. And so, I mean, I think it's through these transformations and the abstraction away from polygons and points and arcs and ellipses that I think is going to be really empowering for people.
Yeah, definitely. So if PlaceIQ were going to give a feed of data that you guys curate and put together, and sorry, I'm going to use some words like smash and curate because yeah. I'm a neo-Luddite. These people are more qualified to talk about this than I am. So if you were going to give a feed into the city's open data initiative, that would be the most interesting thing so that Nick could turn it over to people to start working with it, creating with it, doing stuff with it. What would it look like? And then Nick, how do you see people engaging with it to build stuff?
So I think the most interesting feed would be our feed of movement data. So like I said, we're at our heart, all of our revenue currently is coming from mobile advertising. So we see hundreds of billions of ad requests in the US every single month. I would say in terms of good geospatial data, we do a tremendous amount to actually cleanse that. So that number is cut down fairly significantly, but still billions and billions of locates. Now, this data contains no personally identifiable information. It just has a device ID that's usually hashed by some SDK on a phone. And after we do our cleansing, it has pretty good geolocation, at least certainly down to the 100-meter and sometimes the 9 or 10 meter level. And so I think the most interesting data set we could feed back to New York City data is I think the aggregated movements of people throughout the outer boroughs into Manhattan and especially into Lower Manhattan.
Yeah. Great, thanks. So New York City has a really good handle on its buildings. We know where all the buildings are. We know where the tax lots are. We don't really have a good granular geospatial view of the city like PlaceIQ generates. So if you go to call 311 to complain about something in a park, we're going to have a lot of trouble finding that. If you call to complain about something in a building, no problem at all. So I think some of that work around that base data and how things relate to each other in less structured spaces is one thing where city data can start to merge with things that outside firms are working on. We are very interested in understanding movements of people too. Right now, we do pretty good traffic counts coming in and out of the city because there is a limited number of entrance and exit points, the bridges, all the roads coming in and out of Westchester. But we don't have a great sense of where all the people are, and the fact that over 60% of people either walk or take public transit, that's really important for us to know to manage the city. The best information we have officially for the city is twice a year we go out with umpire pitch counters and sit there for 3 hours at about 100 locations around the city and count how many people walk by. that'll tell you trends. Are more people walking, less people walking? But it doesn't really give you a full view of what it looks like on a cold day, on a Tuesday in September. What does it look like on New Year's Eve? We don't have that kind of information, and I think some of that information coming into the city so that we can understand what the foot traffic looks like and what services we have to provide to support that is an area for expansion.
Definitely. So I'll try to tee one up that I'm winging these, so if you got some in the audience and you want to ask them, just raise your hand in a few minutes and we'll get to you. But for Anthony and for Greta, I've worked down here for about 10 years now, and as much as we would all like to think Lower Manhattan has the physical infrastructure, fiber running through to really, really operate, do we need to be thinking about a different type of model, either through the mesh networks or for something in Lower Manhattan to make it more accessible, more powerful, and able to connect Lower Manhattan with the rest of the world and vice versa? Like, what is the physical plant really required to do it, or is it all already in place?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Scott. And I think the way we've started thinking about data is to kind of remove ourselves from the kind of spatial constraints of data collection and what is interesting in data by kind of getting away from this idea that to collect data, you need to kind of know someone there to go collect it, or you need to kind of have a meeting and go, Mike, like you were just saying, kind of go out there and sort of count people as they walk by, but rather to take it back to your dashboard and just say, this is the data I want, this is the data I want to compare, and I want to compare it to places that might not seem to be the same but actually are very similar. So for example, there's a grid system in New York, and there are grid systems in other cities of the world, and it'd be very interesting to see and compare grid system foot traffic across different cities and not and kind of take a neutral approach to location. It doesn't matter whether it's in Tokyo or it's in Mumbai or somewhere else. And so once you start kind of taking those approaches to looking at data and playing with data, you can kind of become a little more experimental, a little more creative with what you're doing. And I think that what's happening now is we're able to kind of take those approaches as we're able to use geospatial systems or some of the analytical software out there to kind of get away from the pure crunching of data and be able to handle those large numbers and start to get into really the creativity of comparing data and finding useful information about data that then can be used to make decisions or to do work or to solve problems. And so we've kind of solved the analytical issue. We've solved the local collection of data issue. We've solved kind of, to a degree, the sort of electronic collection of data issue by tracking smartphones and things like that. And now Findyr, we're trying to help solve the kind of human collection aspect of data. And that leaves us to really the issues that are most important, which is how do we use it to solve problems or to make decisions.
Great. And I actually would love to get back to the infrastructure piece a little bit, because I think that is what I'm doing here, which is a little different from what the rest of the panelists are doing with data, but you really can't have smart city data unless you have infrastructure, right? So do you guys know that a big deadline just passed for Verizon? Very giant deadline, June 30th? Yeah, do you gentlemen in the purple shirt, you want to shout it out? They failed to build out FiOS to the degree that they said they would by June 30th. And they also refused to give maps of their build out to the city of New York. So that means that people don't know, because there's no transparency, people don't know whether FiOS just decided not to build out to their location or whether they just haven't gotten there yet.
And we also don't know that FiOS is now sentient.
FiOS is a person. Well, Verizon is a person. It has personhood. But aside from that, the other thing to know is that the Verizon switching station in Lower Manhattan flooded during Sandy. So, all of the beautiful data collection and analysis that we can do is completely, stalled if something happens that compromises infrastructure. And I'll point out again that in disaster scenarios, what we've seen over and over and over again, so Katrina, Sandy, the Boston Marathon bombings, is that big infrastructure fails. And it fails because it's got centralized points that can fail, and it fails because the systems get overloaded with traffic. And if any of you were here during Sandy, you experienced this. So I just want to say again that sometimes, as remarkable or strange as it may sound, it's not the big systems that are going to save us. It's not sort of the large corporations that will save us. It's actually people helping their neighbors. And that's sort of the principle that we've been working on. And I think it's related. I would just add to what Sarah was saying about having teams of people that are working on technology and working on big data. The one person I would add to that team is a person who's actually really affected by whatever issue it is that you're talking about. So a person who really experiences the brunt of the failures, right? So that means anybody who's talking about an issue that we deal with in big data, and I think the stop and frisk data and the work that WNYC did with that is a really good example. It's really important to have, as part of that discussion that we have as a society, it's important to have the people that are part of it. So we've actually brought those people into the building of infrastructure in their own communities in the hopes that they'll really get involved with technology, they'll understand it better, they'll get involved with these discussions, and even hopefully in some cases they'll learn the power of data, they'll learn how to collect it and analyze it, and like Sarah was saying, learn how to look at it critically and understand what's being said about these issues.
Yeah, just to echo that point, I was the protagonist on moving a lot of our infrastructure out into different places because the people that we were with during Hurricane Sandy put all their servers on Water Street. And it was named Water Street actually for a reason that we found out during Hurricane Sandy when we lost all our connectivity. But being, I guess, the protagonist doesn't have to be a data person, but I think they do need to be a part of a team. And I'll bring it back to your question. What does the team look like from the protagonist that's telling the story or describing the use case all the way through to when you close out the argument? And what's the chain to get to the visualization that says, here's the way we should go?
It's a big question. Maybe I'll bite off a piece of it. But yeah, I totally agree, Greta, with what you're saying about the protagonist. And that's kind of what I mean about the policy expert, the person who kind of really feels the issue. They need to be involved in it. But I think the team can really start with identifying the question that they want to answer, right? And to think about what is it that we want to say about our community, our environment, and then working with data specialists to think about what is that data that's going to tell that story. And then thinking about creative ways to analyze it. And that's what's really powerful about having a data scientist or a geography specialist or GIS specialist is they can kind of think creatively about how to use that data to kind of understand and dive into that particular their issue that they're looking for. But I think what's interesting about having the team is that it's iterative, right? So you do the data analysis, you look at the results, and then you ask everybody on the team, does this make sense? You go to the community, and oftentimes it doesn't. Your first pass shows you that you're totally missing something from your data model, that it says, for example, everybody really likes to hang out in Times Square in New York. That's probably not true. I don't know. A lot of people do like to hang out in Times Square, but maybe it's a certain kind of person, right? And so kind of diving down deeper into the data sets and kind of speaking with people. And the reason I think this is important, I just want to mention this, is because big data is not really new. We used big data analytics in the 60s and 50s to drive a lot of city planning decisions. And there was a backlash to using data because we didn't take in the human-centered stories. We didn't ask people on the ground how kind of certain decisions were affecting them. And I think the backlash to using data was pretty severe, and it doesn't need to be that way. So if we, in the future, going forward, think about, okay, let's think about our data analytics, and then let's ask people on the ground if they make sense, and let's make plans together, and so kind of hopefully working that way. I don't know if I'm taking over. So that's kind of how you build the teams. But one of the things that I was thinking about, what you were talking about earlier, is kind of trying to get that kind of human count. And one of the things is there's a lot of people that do have human count of the data in the city, right? Every cell phone provider does right now. And I think one of the things that's interesting is how do we navigate that line between private data and public data. And I think that would be an interesting thing to ask you, because that data exists, but you want to use it for the city, but how do you get access to it, or how do you think that you can do that?
Yeah, we have the similar challenges both around some of this quantification of sensor data, whether it's taking digital video feeds and turning them into counts, or whether it's social media, where for the most part we feel like we're on very comfortable legal territory with it. But the question is, what do people want? What are people ready for? And I think that is evolving, and it is highly dependent on sort of what space people are in. I think there's good awareness, especially in Lower Manhattan, that this is a highly surveilled area, and that is, as part of the social compact, that is accepted. But in other spaces, can you see in a window? Can you see in a car? That's still unresolved, and you do get into questions around like the warrant that was issued or not issued in suburban DC, where the GPS was placed on a car outside of the jurisdiction, and you have the ability to follow somebody around with police resources, but when the collection of that information becomes so cheap and easy that it really does start to, instead of taking snapshots of their life, paint a full view of their life, there is not a clean line that you can draw between the government's proper role in it and where it is overly intrusive. And so I think it's hard to articulate that in words or in a decision. So it's still going to continue to be case-by-case basis, and that's what we're seeing around the use of social media and the use of some of the sensor data.
Cool. Well, I think we have a few more minutes left, so we can take some... I'm very proud, by the way, of all the panelists. I don't know if you guys noticed this or not, but not one acronym was used during this entire panel about data and analytics and technology, which I think is a first in all the panels that I've ever been on. So, FiOS. But FiOS is a person now, according to you. All right, so we're going to take some questions if you guys have them. I have no idea how the question... Oh, there's a microphone over there. The questions will be asked over there on that microphone.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, panelists. Thank you very much. That was awesome. There's a lot of information shared and a lot of different focus areas. Some folks using advertising as a monetization basis to go out and change the world. Others coming from places where the world could use more help from data and bringing some of that expertise here. There's a lot of different focus areas. I guess living and working in Lower Manhattan, I'm super interested in wondering what, is there sufficient, like for design, for example, there's a design commission, and every public piece of art or every piece of, public-private real estate work being done has to pass in front of that commission and pass a certain muster or certain, sort of level of quality and level of properness and placement and everything else. And this may be a question for Nick, but if there were such a panel for data in New York City that was kind of like every project or every major initiative needed to pass, in front of some panel, should such a thing exist? Does such a thing exist? And if it did, what in your mind would it look like?
So it does not currently exist. One thing, the ISO just, so we just congratulate ourselves for not using acronym. It's an initialism.
It's FiOS's last name, by the way.
International Standards Organization just released a standards for city management data and city performance data, and we're looking at that to figure out how that can be applied to New York, making sure that we're still providing good service to New Yorkers and not sort of meeting an international standard while diminishing what we do. Our IT department just all new contracts require that data generated by the vendors be shared with the city, so we have access to it. Oftentimes, though, that just becomes a contractual requirement. So it's, oh yeah, I'll give you the data, but it's it's going to be $10,000, $50,000, $100,000 of development effort in order to deliver it to you. So when you're budgeting and you're making sure that you're providing good service to New Yorkers, you say, well, what am I trying to do? You execute on that, and then it's often thought of as an add-on to say, well, let me make sure I can export that data, and let me make sure that it jives with other data the city has. Setting up those standards is something that we haven't done yet. In the city right now, we have roughly 2,000 IT employees centrally, and then 8,000 in the departments, and they have a certain amount of leeway by design because we don't want to centralize everything. We don't want to create a single point of failure. So I think there is room for a federated standards-based model in New York City, and we certainly have discussed it, and the administration is figuring out exactly what its tech policy looks like going forward, and I certainly think that's going to be part of it.
Hi.
Hi. Hi, I'm Janie. I used to work at LinkedIn in Midtown here. I worked in data visualization and presentation for 3 years. I'm actually looking now. My question is kind of general interest.
Anthony is already interested in you.
My question, it might be for Nick or I guess any of you. It's about keeping track of all the big tech companies and the smaller ones that are coming to New York. I know there's like Mapped in NY, and I'm more interested in the ones coming to Lower Manhattan. I know there are a number of sites, but it's actually really hard to navigate those real time. So what's the best way to find out what companies are where, and then jobs? So.
Yeah, I mean, the Made in New York initiative continues, and I would certainly say that is the best answer we have to it. We do try and draw that line between what the government is good at doing and what people in the private sector are good at doing. So I would certainly say we don't have all the answers, but the Made in New York Tech Initiative certainly is the best answer we have to it.
But that's something I think that we could work on as part of the Downtown Alliance and trying to figure out a way to hack some of your data sets to create something that's maybe a little bit more intuitive.
Thank you.
I'll go one. I'd like to talk about infrastructure and communications infrastructure. And at the moment, it's a very kind of top-down business where the providers come to you, and whether more things could be encouraged where people might take it into their own hands, form, local cooperatives that then connect outward to the internet, and there are things that stop it, which are like franchise agreements and, and the rights of way, with the Empire City Subway owned by Verizon and so on. So my question is, how, what could be done, and what have you discovered in terms of doing a mesh network about, shouldn't they encourage entrepreneurship at the application level in the city? Shouldn't they encourage entrepreneurship at the infrastructure level?
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. We are exploring a number of different kinds of models for internet provision that are different from the basic market failure that we're seeing with our duopoly that currently exists. So we basically, at this point, have Comcast, Time Warner, and Verizon. And let's see, Comcast and Time Warner are the two most hated companies in the most hated industry in the country. And we've already talked about Verizon. So the question is, what can we do that's different? And I think for a long time, local governments, due to a lot of pressure from these companies, and they really, let's face it, they have monopoly pressure that they bring to bear. local governments have sort of laid down and died and just let them kind of have their way. The New America Foundation, where I work, we're exploring a number of options. Mesh networks is basically the most kind of like small-scale grassroots model that we're exploring. But we're basically looking at what I'm calling community-supported broadband. So you guys have all heard of community-supported agriculture, right? So basically people get together and they decide they don't want agribusiness to decide what they're going to eat. And so they get together and they support small farmers. So we're asking, why can't we do the same thing for broadband? And obviously there are regulatory issues, there are governance issues, and there are technical issues. But we feel like there are ways to challenge all of those things. And a few of them are co-ops. So there are already some broadband co-ops. They're modeled after the electricity co-ops that have existed for a long time in certain places. There are municipalities that still can, despite a number of regulations, they still can run municipal networks. And then we're looking at solutions that basically build out last mile infrastructure in order to tap into something like a business class or a larger sort of wholesale broadband connection. So these things are possibilities, and we're really looking forward to exploring them. And in New York, as I said, we're looking at building 6 new mesh networks, including one in Lower Manhattan. And the hope is that people in the community would become part of the group that's building the network and maintaining it. So look out for the Lower Manhattan Mesh Network that will hopefully be starting up in about November, because we'll be looking for what we call digital stewards, who are people in the community that do things like make decisions about where the network is going to cover, where the coverage will go, and how they're going to govern it, revenue models, all that stuff. So look out for that, and I'm happy to also share a number of policy briefs and other materials that we've generated on the topic.
And that's fascinating, because that's almost how communication started, with telegraph co-ops happening all over the U.S. before Western Union came in and brought them all together. So it's fascinating to think about the past being the future. I guess we're out of time, so I'd like to thank all of these great panelists. I think some of us will be hanging out and grabbing a beer if you want to ask another question or ask anything personally. So thanks a lot.